Yep.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, hi everyone. Thanks for coming to today's webinar and welcome. So this webinar is in conversation with civil society, youth perspectives meet climate emergency. So thanks for joining us. My name is Samuel. So I'm moderating this conversation. I'm both part of the research team at Civicus and part of the Insured project. And to give you all a brief introduction to what the Insured project is before we dive in, it is a research consortium studying how the EU and its member states can better defend multilateralism and make global governance more robust, effective, and democratic. And its research assesses the state of play in different policy areas, and looking at especially how the EU and other international actors can um, better defend multilateralism and looking at their strengths and weaknesses. So as part of this project, we've organized a series of webinars, kind of connecting the Insured project's research findings to youth and civil society activism. And so we're trying to translate this cutting edge research into practical strategies and concrete guidance for organizations working to reform global governance systems in these policy areas. So this is the first installment of this series, and we're going to be specifically focusing on climate emergency and youth participation and activism. Um, so, given the context that we're in today, where global temperatures have risen above the 1.5-degree threshold, which was set by the Paris Agreement in 2015, this was a benchmark for to prevent the sort of most catastrophic and irreversible impacts of climate change. We've we now understand more than ever the importance of the disconnect between what global governance institutions aim to do and what their actual results are. And so that's why, and also given the recent COP meeting, this webinar is more relevant than ever. So anyway, thank you all for being here. I'm going to introduce our three panelists now. So firstly, Franziska Petri is a postdoctoral researcher at the Leuven International and European Studies Institute at KU Leuven. She's also the co-author of recent Insured reports on global biodiversity governance and on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is also known as the UNFCCC, in case you hear that repeatedly during this meeting. And next, we've got Amandine Orsini, who is a professor of international relations at UCLouvain, working on global environmental issues and negotiations, and also from a youth perspective. And last but not least, we've got Manal Bidar, who is a climate activist and youth advocate from Morocco, with over 8 years of experience in advancing climate action and youth engagement. She's both the communication coordinator at Water Youth Network and a researcher at Civicus. Um, so these are our panelists. So we're now going to go ahead with a brief presentation of the research findings from Franziska and Amandine. Um, Firstly, just to remind you, these webinars will be recorded and made available soon on Civicus's YouTube channel and website. So yeah, feel free to access it online at a later time if needed, or to share it with colleagues who couldn't make it today. Um, so firstly, could we look at the main research results from you, Franziska, with your in
Yes,
terms of your Insured reports? Thank you.
absolutely. Let me just make sure everyone sees my slides. Yes. So thank you so much for the invitation, Samuel. It was great to work together in the Insured project. My name is Franziska Petri. I'm a postdoc, yeah, at KU Leuven. And I was involved in 2 of the 3 reports of our sustainability work package. So I'm not going to talk about everything these reports have to say, but I am going to show you the reports so you can find the links and so on, because they're all publicly available. I'm going to try to narrow it down a little bit to really speak to the question of how civil society actors can be included. I'm going to focus on the UNFCCC, but just FYI, we also have some insights on the CBD. So in the sustainability work package of Ensured, we try to understand how effectiveness, democracy, and robustness play out in global climate biodiversity governance and how they maybe can be enhanced. Now, those are, of course, big concepts, and it's a big question of what is even global climate and biodiversity governance. So we focused on 2 aspects each time for the UNFCCC, so the climate one, and the CBD, the biological diversity one, biodiversity one, where it's about how does decision-making actually work. So these big COPs that we know in the news, and we saw a lot of them, or still incoming now that people are back from Brazil. So how do the negotiations work? How do non-state actors have a role to play or not? And second, we then looked at really the implementation level. So the way that the Paris Agreement works, the way that the KMGBF, the Coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework works, how are different actors involved? How successful are they at actually achieving their targets? How does financing work, and so on? So for each of these, you actually find those reports online. So I was one of the leading researchers for the UNFCCC report, which was published in May this year, where we, among others, have one entire section on how non-party stakeholders, so the different actors that are not parties to the UNFCCC, so non-state actors, are involved as observers, as people providing input, as people who may or may not make statements, and so on. Then we had a second big report on Paris Agreement turning 10. So does it actually deliver on its promises or not? And then the third report came out just last week on both the negotiation side. So how do the CBD negotiations work, and the KMGBF implementation side. And what I want to do now in the next 2-3 minutes is zoom in on one specific question, namely the challenges for civil society actors to participate in climate. And again, some of these also apply, I would argue, for biodiversity governance, because that is the topic of the webinar today, but I do recommend, of course, the read of the whole report at a later stage. So one of the key questions when thinking about civil society actors in global climate governance is how can they actually participate in these mega COPs? So you see here on the right of the slide, one of the graphs showing up until COP28, how many parties, so states, as well as observer organizations, have been participating in COPs. So you see, kind of goes upwards. And we also see, for instance, COP28, more than 17,000 observer organizations. So we are in an age of mega COPs, and the question is, how does that affect civil society actors? One of the things that comes to mind, or that we often heard from interviewees and in the literature, is that there is a problem of access. So finance, visa problems, and so on can be really difficult for civil society actors, in particular from Global South regions or smaller organization, to really handle COPs, because it is quite expensive. I don't know if anyone in the audience ever tried to book a hotel during COP week. I tried once for the Colombia biodiversity one, and I think it was about more than 10,000 for 2 weeks, obviously if you're early and so on. But there are a lot of access hurdles when it comes to like actually just physically joining the COP. And then the second aspect is, well, if you want to join meaningfully, you actually have to understand the process. And when you join your first COP, and I've seen that at various meetings this year, both in the CBD and the UNFCCC, there's a lot of abbreviations to know, there's a lot of meeting dynamics to know. This is where the informal takes place, and so on. So like, it really takes a little bit of time to get used to that. And that, of course, imagine you're starting fresh after having graduated, working in an NGO, you don't have a lot of resources, you don't have experience with that. That can be quite difficult. Then on a more formal side, it's the access that you actually get. So at COPs, you have different spaces. Some are just for negotiators, others are for everyone. Who organizes side events, or who has the money to organize also a pavilion event, and so on. So like, access is not necessarily equal. Related to that, actual influence on negotiators can often be difficult, because as an observer, you can run around, but again, there are certain spaces that you might not have access to. So the question of meaningful participation if you don't actually get to engage with negotiators. Speaking time during meetings, and I'll speak about that when I talk about the next slide, is an aspect, because COPs, both in the CBD and in the UNFCCC, have struggled with agenda items increasing, less speaking time for parties even. And so Observers are often left up for the end of the meeting to speak up. So there's less and less time for observers to speak simply because the agendas are so heavy. And that, of course, limits again the meaningful participation for civil society actors. Moving to the implementation side, how can civil society actors really be meaningfully involved? One aspect that also comes up, and I'll only talk about this briefly, is the question of who can actually access financing, both to go to COPs as well as in, let's say, implementation. Massive debate right now also in the KMGBF context. Also, who can provide expertise? Who can actually submit a formal report on how, for instance, biodiversity action, but also climate action is going? Who is, for instance, being monitored? Who can register their emissions, right? So like who gets to be part of the formal process? Because both the UNFCCC and the CVD remain party driven. So what is the reform potential? That was the second big part, or actually the main part of our report. What's the reform potential to enhance the role of civil society? Again, there's more reform potential aspects. One big question, I'm sure we're going to get back to that during our debate later, is how can we rethink how COP is organized? We have these mega COPs of 50, 60,000 people. It's the size of a small town. Do all of them really need to be in that place? Who should be in which place, right? If you think of the two separate zones, who needs to have access to negotiations? How big do delegations need to be? How often should COPs take place? There are ideas floating around of organizing these mega COPs, the mega Rio COPs even, to coordinate and increase synergies between the biodiversity, desertification, and climate COPs. But everyone seems to be sort of in agreement that COPs haven't grown bigger, and bigger has not necessarily increased both the equal participation for everyone nor the effectiveness. And so COPs and how they're organized as these massive events with a lot of side events, and the circus as it's often called, are a bit in question. Of course, the question is then how, and I'm sure we're going to get back to that later again. The second point is tackling non-party stakeholder inequalities. So one of the aspects here is funding to participate. Non-party stakeholders' concerns can also be integrated in host country agreements. So whenever a COP presidency is chosen, there will be a host country agreement, and trying to include more content to make sure that affordable hotels, no visa problems will be created, and so on. That can, of course, enhance access, particularly for those who have less resources. Third, the question of meaningful participation opportunities. And again, this can take different shades or shapes, depending on whether you're talking about the negotiation or implementation phase. I, for instance, was at the Bonn meetings earlier this year, so the so-called intersessionals. Those are the more technical meetings that take place in between the big climate COPs, and for CBD as well. And there was a debate where parties were talking about, well, if we actually discuss something where observers, where non-party stakeholders are the subject matter, should we maybe give them an extra speaking moment in the beginning? So yes, we do our regional statements, we give the observers the space, and then the parties can come in. But this is something, and this goes back to one of the fundamental problems, that would require parties to give up this idea of this is a fundamentally party-driven process. This is something where states lead the debates, the negotiations, the final outcomes, the reporting process, and so on. Because again, just in that June moment, there was a lack of agreement on even giving the floor to a couple of constituencies, a couple of representatives, such as youth groups, such as research, business, and so on, when the agenda item was related to exactly their concerns. So there is this reluctance to move away from this, because in the UNFCCC, consensus is the key decision-making mode. And this is my final slide, if you think about the kind of combination of interests and how they come together in the UNFCCC, and I could show a similar one for the CVD, it is just very difficult to make sure that you are actually on the same page. And we saw that also now at COP30. There are divides between the countries. And that's why they want to make sure that, or many people or many actors want to make sure that the process actually remains party-driven. So our reports are not entirely hopeful on all fronts. We are not laying out a plan of these are the 20 reform actions, but we kind of show some of the key tensions of taking some actions. And we do also try to, I would argue, show some small informal steps. So for instance, increasing training opportunities, maybe working towards best practices among presidencies, co-facilitators of meetings to enhance the role of non-party stakeholders, and so on. Again, there is more in the report. I do hope this was not too long of an introduction, just to show what our report found.
Thanks, Francisco. That was great. It gave us a lot to think about. And well, just before I ask Amandine to present her own research, do you, Amandine or Manal, have any initial comments on this? As Francisca um, presented us with some interesting ideas here to get us started.
I have a question. I'm wondering, like, again, I'm understanding from your presentation that a mega COP is for you a bad thing. I'm wondering why is that a bad thing? Because at least coming from me, I see it as a good thing because now you have like more civil society, more young people than ever. I mean, in comparison with the smaller COPs. So I'm wondering why would you say that that's necessarily negative?
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me as well. My headphones just gave up.
Yep.
Thank you so much. That is definitely something that is a bit more nuanced in the report. I think for the speed of it, I try to reduce the point a little bit. I do think that there is a lot of added value in having bigger COPs in terms of diverse representations. So in particular for observers, if you would think of, for instance, Global South groups, underrepresented groups, those numbers increasing. Also, when you look at state, and that's another part of the report, so state participation, you have certain countries coming with delegations, dozens and dozens and even hundreds of people, versus some who have their two people there. So that also creates inequality. So to me, it's a question of who's really going there to create added value, who gets a voice. Because again, if you go as an NGO and you don't have a voice in the negotiations, how are you going to have an impact? So I think what I'm a bit, or where I see the problem is when there's a lot of traveling to COP to present a report at a side event, right? So it's a bit more the side activity, and that's what the literature has called a bit this traveling circus or the fair around it. I don't know whether just the amount of people creates added value if the diversity doesn't actually reach the negotiation room. So that's why I see it critically also from a carbon footprint, sorry, point of view. Why does everybody want to go to COP? I think there is an aspect of, well, there's a lot of interesting things to see, but if you're not going to be part of the negotiations, if your voice is not going to be heard, how can you leave an impact for actual climate or biodiversity action? So I think there is an argument for more diverse COPs and maybe COPs where delegation sizes are at a more equal level to balance out those inequalities. But I don't know if bigger COPs actually have led us to more successful implementation. And I think that's a little bit where in the literature I've read a lot of arguments or also talking to different stakeholders, like it gets a little bit distracting that it's just the whole town of it in this massive fair house. I don't know if Amandine, you have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's a difficult question. I think I was also a little bit, I mean, not worried, but I was thinking if the idea is to reduce the number of participants to COPs, I'm not sure that's the best idea. Or it sounds a bit like if there is even a selection process to go there, it's going to be difficult. But I also agree that maybe the problem is more, as you said, that many people go to COP just because it's becoming fashionable to say have been to a climate COP, and not really because they're interested in the content of the agreements, and that's an issue. I can see this much more for climate COPs compared to biodiversity COPs, but it's also because biodiversity COPs happen every 2 years, so there is less this fashionable element of biodiversity COPs. And indeed, people tend to say and believe that biodiversity COPs work better because it's, I mean, the people attending biodiversity COPs are really there for biodiversity governance and not to attend side events or meet people or be in a nice place wherever so yeah, but I think it's a really difficult question. And yeah, and the other thing I was also thinking is that, of course, there is what happens at the COP, but there is also a lot of preparation to the COP. And I think that the civil society groups which manage to have an influence during the COP are the ones which are very well prepared. So well ahead of the COP, they study the documents, they draft their position. So they also go there, but they also do a lot of preparatory work. And I think that makes a difference. But again, as you mentioned, Franziska, this requires resources. Material resources, time is also a huge issue. But yeah, I also at least see it as a positive sign that if you prepare, maybe, then you're gonna have more impact on the COP compared to people who just go there. But that's a difficult question.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, Amandine, if you would be able to give us a brief outline of your own research on youth in global environmental politics. I think it'd be really interesting for us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry I did not prepare slides because I did not know I could use some, but that's fine.
No problem.
I think the idea was just to talk a little bit about how is current research on youth evolving, on youth in global environmental politics. And no, just to say that as Franziska has been shown with graphs, there has been an increasing involvement of people going to COPs, but also youth a lot. So since especially 2018 and the huge climate marches organized, led by Greta Thunberg, the number of youth attending international environmental negotiations has also been rising. The fact is that for very long, research has concentrated on the marchers, so the youth marchers, the ones in the streets doing protests, and we had few research on youth involved in negotiations, at the exception of one key researcher, Harriet Tew, from the UK, who followed the UNFCCC COPs already some time ago. But recently, after 2018, quite a number of researchers have been starting to work on youth, including me for a research project. So just to say also that for a very long time, of course, research has concentrated on unique COPs. So it was just youth at COP, I don't know, 21, 22, etc. And mostly on climate issues. Whereas we have increasing research also on biodiversity negotiations. So my project started in 2022 already, from 2022 until today, no, 2021 even. And the idea was to cover more than just climate negotiations. So the project, it's actually entitled Youth Earth. The project has been following youth attending climate, biodiversity, and the Sustainable Development Goals negotiations. And we wanted a temporal scope, a broad temporal scope to be able to talk about more than just one meeting. So the project has covered climate, biodiversity, and sustainable development main meetings from 1992 until 2025. And when I say 1992, actually, I think the first climate COP was in 1994. No, the first biodiversity COP, I think, was 1994 and climate 1995. But yeah, let's say more or less over 30 years. I've been working together with Hichan Kang, Juan Felipe Duque, and Anaël Vergonjan, also just to say that I was not the only one. And we have tried to do three things. First, identify youth. And that's not that easy, and we could talk about it. It's not easy because children and youth is recognized as a major group within United Nations processes. So for Sustainable Development Goals negotiations, we have the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth since 1992. But for climate, Yango, so the youth platform of the climate negotiations was created only, I think, in 2010 or 2011. And it's going to be more or less the same for GIBIN, which is the Global Youth Biodiversity Network for Biodiversity Negotiations, which is the main youth platform within the process. It's not so the first was to try to identify youth, and it's not easy also because as Franziska explained also, individuals attend climate COPs, but they have to register through organizations. And also the fact is that you can define youth in two ways. You can define youth as an age group. Within and that's interesting. Within the climate negotiations, the age limit of the youth age group is 35. In Sustainable Development Goals negotiations, it's 30. So there is no unique definition of youth in international processes. So it can be an age group, but youth, of course, is also a social identity, meaning that there are quite a number of NGOs, like children NGOs, which also follow international negotiation processes. Children and Youth International, Save the Children, lots of huge organizations working on youth. And they also can participate to Yango, GIBIN, or the UNFCCC, because these platforms are open to youth defined as an age group, but also to what we call youth serving organizations. And this is also where it becomes interesting, because it means youth are represented by non-youth in terms of age groups, which is fine. Third-party representation is very common in politics, but still it can also raise some questions. So first to identify, and just to mention, we have published a database, an open access database on youth participants. I mean, the ones we identified. So both youth as a group and youth within youth serving organizations. Of course, anonymized, because, for quite a number of reasons, but also because, unfortunately, as you know, environmental activists are also running against difficult situations in a number of countries today. So we have published an anonymized version of the database that gives at least an overview of how many. And I joined Franziska in the results that the number of at least youth is increasing. And now we have even several thousand youth attending COPs, and also indications of where they come from. And again, I agree. I mean, we have the same results as Franziska, that many of them come from what we would call the global north. But still, there are quite also a number of them from the global south. For biodiversity negotiations, for instance, we had a look in details at where they come from, and there is still a sort of diversity of youth. And I'm going to try to be maybe quicker. The second thing, of course, we did was to try to look at their motivations. So why do we have youth in these processes? Because if we think a little bit about it, it's very surprising. We're talking about huge international processes with 192 states, whereas we're talking about an age group that is, of course, very young. Youth serving organizations have more experience, but overall the youth group is made of non-professionals. They're going to school, they're starting their first job, they don't have a lot of money. So it's a very precarious group. So it's surprising to see them in international processes. And on motivations, I can just briefly say that we mostly find that they go to international meetings because they have faced environmental problems at home when they were very, very young, and or because they have learned about environmental problems at school/university. So they've been very aware of the climate changes and the disappearance of biodiversity, and want to do something to solve these issues. And the third thing that we have tried to look at is their influence and the difference they can make in international processes. Also, just to say that we've conducted more than 200 interviews with youth attending biodiversity, climate, or sustainable development goals meetings. And for influence, of course, the picture is a bit mixed. And I don't know if you want me to develop it now, or maybe if we come back to it later, because I just feel I've been already talking quite a lot.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for your input. It was really fascinating to hear about that, and the sheer number of interviews that you've done is also impressive. I think what we should do now is maybe look back to looking at these huge international processes and what they've been trying to do and connecting the processes to the outcomes. So I was wondering, Franziska, if I could ask you, how do you feel that the UNFCCC's decision-making deficiencies that you've documented explain the implementation gaps we see in especially the Paris Agreement's delivery on its promises?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's not an easy question in the sense that who's to blame for inaction. I mean, what we see at every COP is that there is, of course, a momentum created. And I think that is something important also when we think about mega COPs, to link to the previous question again. Of course, the more people report about the planetary crisis, the climate crisis, the more attention the topic gets. I think that is something positive, right? Because it raises awareness, it increases salience of the topic, and so on. And again, diverse type of actors can talk about it. However, what we do see in terms of implementation, in terms of emission reductions, is not where it needs to be. And so I think then the question is, okay, what has to be different domestically? And that is something that states need to tackle, or maybe different also non-state actors need to tackle, and what can the UNFCCC do differently? And to me, it always comes back to what I also mentioned earlier briefly, is the party-driven process. The fact that changes, but also more ambitious decisions, need to be agreed on by consensus. And that often, not always, means that you fall back to the lowest common denominator. Because if you need to convince everyone in the room, already when you want to take a dinner decision among 5, it's going to be difficult. When you're among 190, some of them heavily reliant on fossil fuel exports, it's going to be a difficult moment. And we saw that at COP30, where, particularly on fossil fuel language, the House was divided. And so because you can't go far, you can't go further, I think it's an automatic, you're going to stay behind. If you're expecting, again, this kind of top-down process of let's take decisions, let's be ambitious at the UNFCCC level to then implement domestically. And I think that's where, simply because the way the UNFCCC takes decisions is designed as that, and I think it's also important that it is designed like that. That will be maybe my second point. There is an inherent limitation. States can always do more, right? So if in the UNFCCC format you cannot agree on more because of consensus, because of some states blocking, and we have a clear track record of certain states blocking more than others, you can still do more, but then maybe it's not the action coming from the UNFCCC itself, but the UNFCCC in its decisions can enhance domestic action or can inspire more action. The second point is maybe something, at least that I personally find quite important, is this question of inequalities of participating in the UNFCCC process. So I talked about the non-party stakeholder perspective, and Amandine just talked about the different types of resources and the precarities of certain actors in particular, but you also see this at state level, right? Again, you have the small states, or least developed states, small island states, who go with smaller delegations. They struggle to keep up with the agenda. They have parallel meetings going on. They also maybe don't have the same kind of resources for all kinds of reporting tasks, implementation tasks. And so because the process is, in a way, unequal, I think the ownership of, let's say, the actions also doesn't always work, because, again, if you see a negotiation results that came out of 10 different meeting rooms, but you're there with one person, that's going to be difficult. And again, it doesn't mean that small states would not push for more action, right? But it's just a question of, acknowledging inequalities, which will make it difficult to reach the same kind of implementation level. And then maybe as a last point, I do think the question of these non-party stakeholders, as they're called, so like how do youth actors come in? I think when you look at these high-level speeches, you will see a lot of references to youth actors, right? Like we're thinking of our grandchildren here and so on. We need to save our planet for those that come after, and I think that's also why it's so important to have these kind of youth actors there. Same for business, right? You'll hear a lot of commitments about this is where business actors need to take certain action and so on. But does it actually go beyond those rhetoric claims if then these actors are not heard, if these actors are not necessarily involved in traceable formal decisions, because it is a party-driven process? So I think that's where the stakeholder question is just crucial, because climate action concerns many more actors than state-led actors. And how can the process, again, if it is a party-driven process, how can it take those into account? I could say more, but maybe we come back in the discussion in a moment, or maybe Amandine has something to add.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Franziska. I just actually wanted to ask Manal if she had something to add as well, because I was wondering how these institutional failures and disconnects manifest in your work as a youth climate activist. And what does this gap between the process and outcomes look like from the ground level of organizing?
Yeah, thank you so much. If I may, I just wanted to respond to a few points that were raised earlier. I think the first one is I personally think having a mega COP is not a bad thing. It just reflects how important and urgent climate change is. Because when you compare that, for example, with biodiversity and desertification COPs, I have not attended the biodiversity one, but I have been following the desertification one last year in Saudi Arabia. And you see that I felt very underwhelmed. I mean, there was not a lot of momentum, not so many people attended. There was not a lot of side events. I mean, even though like the space was probably more inclusive than COP, but again, you didn't feel that desertification was such an important and persistent issue for a lot of states and civil society and so on. So I don't think that having a mega COP is necessarily a bad thing. I think the real issue is that now more space is given to fossil fuel lobbyists who come and have like a party badge and have like literally free access to these negotiation rooms, whereas we as young people in civil society struggle to even get to COP itself. And I think here this is an issue not only of states who give these fossil fuel lobbyists access to these rooms, but also it's an issue of the UNFCCC Secretariat, because they could be enforcing more transparency and integrity to make sure that the lobbyists do not have as much access as they do. Because just in this COP, I think about 1,600 lobbyists were just walking there. And again, whose interests are they pushing for? Of course, not ours. Of course, not the interests of the people most affected by climate change. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is, I think for us as young people and in civil society, COP itself is a party-driven process, and if these parties were actually reflecting our interests, and if these parties were going there and thinking really about how can we move forward towards a climate resilient future, then none of us, either young people or civil society or women or other stakeholders, none of us would feel the need to actually go to COP. But then we find ourselves like right now, I was just telling Samuel before this meeting started that we probably should be like spending our time doing other stuff, enjoying life, doing cool things with our lives. But then instead we find ourselves extremely anxious about our future. We find ourselves needing to do activism because we feel like these parties are not representing our interests. And so we find ourselves really needing again to like show up in COP. And I would say that it's a good thing that COP is becoming sort of more inclusive towards our participation. Again, you see more young people than ever at COP. But then at the same time, in terms of influence, there's not much that we can do. And this is, again, because of the nature of COP itself. But I must say as well that I'm technically also a researcher, I guess. I did my thesis on youth and climate governance, and I was examining this I was examining more the dynamics of youth participation. And what I saw is that right now, because of how COP is becoming more huge, COP is becoming sort of, more open towards your youth participation, this is creating a fragmentation between the young people who want to engage like through advocacy and the young people who want to engage more radically. So the people who manifest, the young people who manifest, so this is like more like Greta Thunberg, more like Fridays for Future, but even within COP, like the young people who choose to do actions and the young people who choose to engage through like more institutionalized manners. So for example, through the newly created initiatives like the Youth Climate Champion, there's also this new Youth Climate Forum and so on. And I think it would be very interesting to also look at civil society and young people not as a monolith, but also as, a group that has like its own divides. And you see also that there is a huge fragmentation between the interests of Global South young people and Global North young people. Global South young people would be kind of more pushing for adaptation needs, for instance, whereas Global North young people are more towards like fossil fuel, transition away from fossil fuel and so on. So I think that's also a very interesting point to bring up. And lastly, I think that we as young people in civil society, we feel extremely disappointed and frustrated. And for so long, that frustration and that disappointment has been the source of why we do this in the first place. But now we find ourselves extremely kind of disconnected from these institutions. This is my fifth COP that I attended, and I'm like starting to question why am I even there? Because again, you see a lot of recognition and visibility that does not translate into influence. I think I can come in later on the little successes and the little wins that we had as young people in civil society. But again, we feel very disconnected and we're losing trust in this process. And we're not the only ones. I mean, a lot of countries, I mean, if anyone here was looking at the closing plenary, a lot of countries are losing trust in this process. Like, what is the point of having these COPs if nothing gets done? And I think you see this not just in terms of climate change, but also in the broader scheme of multilateralism and global governance, because this is not just only in climate change, I mean, it's everywhere. Countries do not want to cooperate together, and nobody wants to include civil society anymore. There is the far right that is rising in Europe. There's so much going on, and you can feel it. Like when you go to COP, you can feel that this is not only about climate change, but there's just multilateralism crisis everywhere that is, again, excluding our voices from the conversation. Sorry, that was so long, but yeah.
No, not at all. Thank you, Manal, for that. We'll definitely loop back again for your recent experience at COP and the little wins you can tell us about that. I think now let's focus on youth engagement challenges and opportunities. And so I was wondering, Amandine, if you could tell us a bit about what you think or what you found about the specificities of youth as a civil society constituency, and what different forms of youth engagement there are in climate governance.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's important to mention these specificities. Also, because I think some of these specificities also explain the frustration of youth. I mean, it's difficult to have a full list, but I would at least mention three. The first is one I already mentioned earlier, which is the children and youth group is not a professional group, which is not a problem. I mean, it's not a problem in terms of they actually have a lot of expertise and experience and knowledge and lots of input to make in the negotiations, but not professional in the sense that it's not their job to be there. And when I just heard Manal mentioning lobbyists, and lobbyists also are like paid by fossil fuel industry, indeed, it's a problem because it's not the case for youth. I think out of our more than 200 interviews, 200 youth that we interviewed, and we also conducted surveys during COPs, 99% of them are there on a voluntary basis. So no, I mean, no youth is really paid to attend negotiations. They can get a little bit of compensation sometimes for their flight or accommodation, but it's very rare. And it's even more surprising that some of them have official mandates So with regards to the formats, youth can still participate within national delegations. Since 1995, there is the UN Youth Delegate Program, which pushes, it's just again a program on a voluntary basis, which invites states to include young people in their delegation. And the UN Youth Delegate Program was meant to be targeting the UN General Assembly, so not necessarily climate negotiations or biodiversity negotiations, but increasingly states are also trying to apply it for climate, biodiversity, or sustainable development goals negotiations. So a few youth participate in these negotiations with a party badge as an official youth delegate. But also there are no clear guidelines about how they're supposed to be included. So in some delegations, they're very well included. I think Scandinavian countries are very famous for including youth in a meaningful way, but it's not the case of all delegations. So they're not professionals. They're there on a voluntary basis. And this is one specificity of youth. The other specificity, of course, is the fact that it's a moving category, especially if you think of age range. Of course, you're 35 and then you're 36, you're not youth anymore. That's, I think, also a strength of the movement because it means, from what we've seen in our research, that they also advance positions that go well beyond their age group. Usually they're worried about environmental justice in general, not just for youth. They have very few youth claims, if there are. The only one they have is indeed to have a seat at the negotiations and be included because they still have to fight to have this seat. So it's a moving category. That's just a problem for, I would say, organizational learning, sorry, because of course there is a high turnover within the youth group, and that limits a little bit their influence. The third specificity of youth is maybe a more positive one, is the fact that compared, because they're not professional, because they're a moving category, because they're there on a voluntary basis, they have no hidden agenda. So we're talking about a group that really think about environmental ambition, really think about justice. They're also very well aware of other sorts of issues with regards to human rights, gender balance, intersectionality. So they're there really because they believe that it's important to push all these agendas together. And what we also see is that despite the difficulties, many of them still go to several COPs, and some of them even manage to go to biodiversity and climate and sometimes sustainable development goals negotiations, because the agenda they want to push forward is a transversal one. As I said, it's more than just one environmental topic. It's a broader agenda. Yeah, and yeah, I could, if Manal talks about the successes, I can then maybe talk about the limits that we found out in our research. I think it would be a good complement.
Yeah, of course. I was going to ask Manal how what your experiences were at the COP, but also how effective you think youth engagement has been in your view. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I think it has been very effective. I think young people are really doing the most they can with the limited resources they have. And I think that is really honorable because if you compare like young people specifically to civil society, it's even harder to access these spaces because young people like youth-led organization, it's very difficult to be as part of a youth-led organization just to get like to get through the bureaucratic process of registering your own organization and so on. So and there's not a lot of observer youth-led organization that are accredited. So I think like given the limited resources we have, I think we're doing a lot. I just wanted to mention a few successes. I think the first one is that the official youth negotiator on behalf of all LDCs, so the LDCs negotiator negotiation bloc, is actually a youth negotiator. She's the one negotiating on adaptation, and she's really amazing. Again, an example of how young people can own these spaces and can like push for the agendas of their countries, not like through like observer status, or not through actions, or the limited, but like young negotiators can actually have influence. And every time she's in the room, like she's calling out all of these like big fossil fuel countries, and like you and she was doing it in such a courageous way, and it was really inspiring to all of us to see that young people can make it there and can have like influence. But again, she's the exception, not the rule. And there's a lot of other countries negotiation blocks, or there's a lot of other delegations that have youth negotiators, but those are just like there for helping the party delegates like to get them some coffee or to just draft their statements. So like their influence is not very tangible. I think I have to also say that in the last COP there's this concept of the BLM action mechanism, or the BAM, that all civil society was pushing for. And we did organize a lot of actions on it. We did a lot of lobbying. We had a lot of bilaterals with so many other organizations. And in the end, like it was actually like adopted in the final, despite the blocking of so many other states. And it was a concept that was, again, like framed and created by civil society. And us as young people were pushing so hard for it, and it was adopted. So I'm super happy about that. I was also personally following the adaptation negotiations. And in the adaptation text, we have a mention of intergenerational equity, and we have a mention of women, people with disability, and it's like unprecedented. Like for the first time in the adaptation text, we have a mention of that, and it was only thanks to again all of the bilaterals that we had with all of these different negotiators, and we were telling them that we want this to be there, and we succeeded, and there is a mention. Of course, it's not very substantial because it's good to have like a mention of intergenerational equity, but it does not mean anything if the actual, adaptation text is not implemented. And what happened is that they went from 100 indicators for national adaptation plans to 100 indicators. So, for example, when you want to do an adaptation plan, it should be based on indicators such as peace, such as migration, women inclusion, etc. And then they went from 100 to 59. So again, it's nice to have that mention of intergenerational equity, but what's the point if the actual decision does not serve young people, does not serve people most impacted by it? I think there's also a lot of wins in terms of, representation. Again, we had a lot of slots to like have to deliver like speeches and so on in the opening ceremony, in the closing ceremony as well. But again, the influence of that cannot be quantified and is again very limited. So maybe I'll just end it there and say that I think it's very sad that we do not have as much influence as we want to. But it's also really great that despite within the limited resources that we have, we still are contributing to a lot. And that if we were not there, then a lot of these little wins would not have happened. I can maybe like talk a little bit afterwards about the work that we did. Like we pushed so hard to organize a lot of bilaterals with so many countries, and so many countries did not want to have us, but then we were pushing for it so hard, and we were following them. I think on social media there's a lot of reels of young people following the UK negotiator after he said like we don't want the BLM action mechanism, and they were stalking him and they were like, shame on you. And so I think there's a lot that's it brings me a lot of pride and joy to belong to a group that is pushing so hard for our demands. But it's also very disappointing to see that at the end of the day, like these little wins probably don't matter in the broader image of things.
Thanks, Manal. That's really great to hear, and I think it does matter. It's encouraging to hear these small wins, which is much better than nothing, for sure. Amandine, would you be able to talk a bit about what you see as the limits of youth engagement and what could be improved?
Yeah, briefly, because I think it might help also identify solutions. Because I'm professor of international relations, so from my perspective, small wins is already a lot. I mean, for global politics, small wins is already a lot. Unfortunately, we are in a very diverse world with lots of different states. So small wins is already a lot. And I completely agree with Manal that youth is very efficient for the very few resources they have. They're very, very good. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that for quite some time, and it's still true today, researchers have been insisting on the material limits of youth involvement in international negotiations. I mentioned already some of these. The other issue that I forgot to mention is, for instance, for visa application. As you probably know, it's much easier if you have a job, if you have money, if you and when you're young, again, if you're studying, then even visa application is much more difficult than for any other category. I also wanted to say that there is a lower age limit to attend at least climate COPs, which is 16. But meaning that some youth even have to ask the authorization of their parents slash tutors if they want to come to climate COPs. So people insist on the material limits, lack of funding. There's some scholarships also provided by international organizations such as UNICEF, for instance, for youth to attend international negotiations. The problem is that most of the time they're limited scholarships, and from the interviews that we conducted, it's also clear that very often youth obtain the final decision for these scholarships very late. And again, if you need to travel, if the COP is happening in another continent, if you have to have your visa application, passport application, knowing like 2 weeks before the COP that you got a scholarship is just too late. So one thing is also timing for all this funding, limited funding that is available. That would be great, according to youth, to have notification much ahead of the meetings. And the other thing is that very often the selection process is not necessarily clear, and from one COP to the other, institutions usually prefer to choose different people. And that's fine, because the idea is to give the opportunity to as many young people as possible to attend these processes. But again, for learning, this is not good, because it means that if you once got a scholarship, it might be more difficult for you to get another one for the next COP. And the first COP is always overwhelming for anyone. The first COP is always overwhelming. So usually we say that you're becoming more efficient at your second or third COP, so you need. But what I also wanted to mention is that research has also been shown that there are a number of limits related to what I would call the perceptions of youth and related to youth. So for quite a long time, Arietu has been showing that the self-perception of youth was a limit to their meaningful involvement, meaning that they tended to perceive themselves as less legitimate than others to be in these international processes. I think that's much less the case, which is a good thing, because Aritu was saying that, of course, if you go there and you're a bit shy and you don't dare to speak, then it's complicated. So I think this is becoming better. But from my research, what I see as a problem is not self-perception, it's the perception of youth by others. And really, to put it very frankly, problems of age discrimination. Actually, some individuals prefer not to be part to the children and youth group, not to be labeled as youth, because there is still this adultism. I mean, we are in societies where decision makers are quite old compared to the population. We are in societies where we consider that older age means more experience, more expertise. And so many youth have been facing, age discrimination, what they call youth washing, just, being called by some delegation to take nice pictures, but not really to ask them about their opinion, asking them to circulate things on social media but not asking them to contribute to the content of the social media. So all these things that are also sometimes labeled as tokenism, this is a real problem. And that's interesting because I think within climate negotiations, youth is facing this age discrimination problem, but also increasingly older individuals like seniors. If you look at climate litigation cases. So yeah, at least my research and the research I conducted with my team also reveals that we have a problem with age discrimination, and youth is also sometimes aware of that.
Okay, thanks very much. I think now that we've heard a bit about these limitations, let's think a bit about the reform possibilities and strategies going forward in terms of where to go next. So, Franziska, I was hoping to ask you about the given the fragmented landscape of climate governance institutions, where do you think reform efforts should focus for maximum impact on both effectiveness and democratic legitimacy?
Yeah, thank you so much. Just to also do a quick comment, I think. Thank you also for those inspiring insights and how youth can change. And I think this is something that also attending these kind of COP or SB meetings myself, like you sit there for hours and hours and you observe and you see how stuck everything is. Then you see the little wins and you leave and you feel really the joy, and because you know that yes, it was maybe just a small addition, right? The mention of intergenerational, but that will be in the text and that will be able to be expanded on next year. And that is why you need these kind of multilateral forums, right? Not just the regional, not just the EU pushing for something, but if you actually manage to find a consensus that is meaningful, that adds a new, even if it's just one adjective, that can change a lot. But again, is it sufficient for what we need? And that's why we need to talk about the reform points. As I said in the reports, we reached very careful conclusions because also doing all these kinds of interviews, again and again, we got stuck with, yeah, but that's not going to happen because consensus is not going to be possible and there are certain obstructors. And that's why in our report, we kind of argue for more, let's say, soft measures. I think there's a couple of key themes. One is, in general, the question of how to stop negotiating and coming up with new action agendas versus actually speeding up implementation, which, at least talking to different stakeholders, I feel is a bit of a mindset and commitment question, which again is a big question, right? But to me, that is a bit also why I'm, let's say, more skeptical of the phenomenon of, okay, let's just go every year, repeat how important, and we go home and don't really follow up. So I think that's a little bit where I think key leadership is important. And I do think the Brazil presidency started very strong. And I think they also kept pushing. And I would be curious to see also what Manal thought experiencing the Brazilian presidency. But the whole Mutriao idea, right? Like really bringing everyone together and let's do this together and not just keep negotiating. But then we are going to keep negotiating. But then what is the substance that we negotiate? So how can, for instance, the agendas be streamlined so that we don't keep debating the same things every year? We don't lose time on things, right? Obviously, each agenda item has its aspect, but that's at least one of the things we focus on in the report as one way to maybe reduce the negotiation for the sake of negotiation impressions that some people have. I think another point is really the COP organization. So who has access to what, who has formal speaking rights and so on, who has access to meetings, who doesn't. Manal mentioned earlier also these aspects of greenwashing actors running around COP, right? There are some reform suggestions on that. So increasing transparency, and I think the Secretariat has really worked on that a little bit. And again, you need to find consensus because everything the Secretariat implements needs to have been mandated by the parties. So I think COP organization in terms of attendees, access rights, speaking rights, that would be one aspect. The second point that I mentioned was the agendas. And then I think there's one bigger question, which is towards effectiveness, this question of the Rio Convention teaming up. So the super COPs, which personally I'm a little bit skeptical of, simply because of the silos that exist and the many agendas that exist within each COP. But I am surprised to see that this is a bit gaining traction, at least a little bit, in some LinkedIn posts and so on. And the secretariats just have launched, so the 3 Rio secretariats just launched a website together where they emphasize the synergies between them. And I think also at Leuven, for sure, there was an emphasis on the synergies. At the CBD meetings I attended, it was also emphasized. So the question is, what would that look like? But I feel like to move towards effective implementation, if done well, this could help. But then how do you do it well? So those would be my 3 cents. And then, of course, there's more in the article. And decisive leadership of international actors and actually following up domestic ambition. But that's just the 4th general point.
Thanks very much. Well, Manal, do you have any thoughts on this or any additional thoughts from your experience at COP and Brazil's leadership? And also, do you have any ideas of potential options for reform to enable meaningful youth participation and any potential for breakthrough in that regard?
Yeah, I just wanted to say also to comment on a few points. I do like empathize with the fact that and totally like kind of upset that the average age of like parliament members in the continent I come from in Africa is 65. And I'm thinking these people who are, I mean, sorry for the framing, but who are going to leave this planet soon, they are negotiating on behalf of, like, they are negotiating the future that we are inheriting. And it's just, it's so upsetting that you see all of these negotiators who are not, you know, who cannot like represent us, because again, like we have like our future is at stake, and sometimes they struggle to understand that. And I feel like if we had like more youth negotiators leading this, then they would feel like more urgency to negotiate this, because again, it's their future at stake. And it's even more upsetting because this is the reality, especially in the global south. Our countries right now are dealing with floods, dealing with droughts. People are losing their lives. Communities are being displaced. I mean, I think everyone is aware of the recent Southeast Asia floods. And I think it's really upsetting to me that everyone is seeing this happen, but still choose to not act on it. And I think just like an incident that happened in the last COP is there was a fire in the venue. I don't know if there was a fire in the venue. And for everyone, for a lot of people, that was their first experience of needing to evacuate, or that was their first experience of fire. Now imagine that that is actually the reality for so many communities who deal with wildfires like every day. And right after the fire, like you would think that these delegates would probably like that was a shock for them. Like they would probably like rethink like how, especially the countries that were blocking, but then that did not happen, and they just continue to further block a lot of language on fossil fuel and so on. So I think it's really upsetting to me that there are people who care so much like ourselves, and there are people who don't care, and it is the people who don't care who have so much power to influence these decisions. I think the Brazil presidency did a lot of like much better job than the one last year, in terms of like trying to get everyone to like submit everything on time. And last year the final plenary ended up like being on Sunday, like it continued for 2 extra days, but this one was finished on Saturday. But a lot of people were upset because in the final closing, the president, again, he was supposed to say to everyone, okay, does anyone has any objections or anything? And he did not. He just continued saying, oh, this is adopted, this is adopted, this is adopted. And there was a country, Colombia, for example, who was like, we cannot accept this mitigation work program if it does not mention fossil fuel. And he just adopted it without hearing them out, without hearing a lot of Latin American countries who also shared the same concerns. Like, we cannot accept this if it does not mention fossil fuel. And I think what ended up happening is now a lot of people, including us young people, are looking towards external processes like the upcoming conference on transition away from fossil fuels, which will be hosted by Netherlands and Colombia, as a substitute of this COP that is not delivering the outcomes that we want. And it's very concerning to me that there's this, we're leaving multilateralism towards this other process that is just starting in April 2026. And a lot of us are like, again, losing trust in this process. And what is the point of COP in general if it's not a COP of implementation, if it's not a COP of ambition, if it's not a COP of action? And I wanted to also respond to the parts on implementation. I think implementation happens at the national level. So a lot of the action that can be done is done through NDCs. And I think that's where us as young people and civil society can push for more action and ambition. Again, that is very hard in countries that have a lot of repression, in countries that don't have any like civic space. But I think that is like one way in which we can ensure that the COP actually delivers, which is through NDCs. Because again, climate action is implemented at the national level. And COP can just serve to trigger countries to do more, but we can still do that at the national level. So I think hope for more climate action and ambition is not totally lost, and there's a lot of work we can do at the national level. Again, limited because certain countries don't even have civic space. And lastly, I wanted to talk about the like reforms. There has been in recent years some not reforms, but like initiatives to include more young people. I think I mentioned few. In COP27, for the first time, we've had a COP Youth Envoy. In COP28, it became a COP Youth Climate Champion, and it's a dedicated team of young people that are supposed to like, represent us. And then within the same year in COP28, we've had the International Youth Delegates Program, which again brought 100 young people from all over the world. But then, so in my thesis, I was examining whether these initiatives are a good thing. And I think the answer is no, because when young people are institutionalized within this, it really corrupts our values. We end up speaking the same language as the host country, which institutionalized us. And an example of that is last year in the Youth Climate Forum, which was again organized by this Youth Climate Champion, which is again chosen by the host country. Young people were not able to use the term climate refugees because it was too political for the host country. And so I think it's very interesting to me that even when you try to have these new institutions and have these new initiatives to include more young people, it just sometimes it ends up fragmenting the movement more, and it ends up like corrupting and co-opting our narrative. And somehow you're using our name, again, youth washing and tokenism, you're using our name as young people to push for your own narrative and your own agenda, some of which we're not even on board with. Like, again, we want to use climate refugees, and we believe that climate migrants are refugees. But then you say no, because it does not align with your political agenda. So I think there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of disappointment, there's a lot of anger, and it's just so sad. I mean, for the longest time, this anger and disappointment has motivated us. This anxiety was the reason why we come to these spaces, but at this point, like we're so done with this process, like honestly. Yeah, so sorry, that was such a pessimistic note to end on, but yeah.
No, thank you, Manal, for that. Well, I would like to just come back to you all for a final question to look ahead and little final notes to leave us on. But firstly, Franziska, I was wondering what you mentioned the EU at the end there, and I was wondering what you feel the EU could do perhaps in terms of maintaining the ambition that's needed and to strengthen climate governance in this area. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, as a scholar working on the EU, this is of course a crucial question, and we have a section in each report reflecting on that because there are certain things that the EU definitely says and does, and there are, of course, always the perceptions of others. And there are also actors who say, yeah, thank you, EU, but maybe we're not as interested in those views, right? And those are entirely fair things. It's the same when Trump goes somewhere and says something. So I think the EU in itself has for a long time conveyed the message of we're trying to lead here, we're setting high ambitions on climate finance. I think that's one of the big claims, and I think the EU is an important actor when it comes to climate finance as well as technical assistance. At the same time, looking at some of the internal developments right now, I think this environmental leadership point also needs at least some questioning in terms of looking at the current ambitions and how long it took, for example, right before the COP to agree on the NDC. So I think that's, as a bit of a political opinion, is a bit of a problematic point if the EU is really the actor we look at in terms of environmental leadership, in terms of sticking up strong, like staying strong. But I think in terms of environmental leadership, there is an important aspect that the EU has been doing, which is building coalitions. So the High Ambition Coalition, for instance, I think is an example where the EU has tried to build not just here we are as the EU, do what we want. That is not the approach, right? But like build coalitions with others. And I think in particular in the past, Trump presidency one, we saw them really like building these kind of linkages, building different kind of declarations with ASEAN and so on. So like keeping up the momentum. And I think that is my expectation and hope that the EU will keep doing that. But not by going it alone, but by being ambitious domestically, and building those coalitions with others. So I think it's a bit of a two-level game in the sense that you need to look at the domestic context, and there I think ambition needs to be higher. Looking at the targets that are there, but then also about the international, not just thinking of what is in the EU's interest, but also what does the international community need. And I would say the Trump presidency does leave a bit of a gap in terms of staying on course. So that would be my hope for the EU and the analytical point you read in the report.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks very much for your points on this. Now, I was wondering if we could just have perhaps a final concluding remark from all three of you about perhaps linking climate governance with youth participation and looking at what comes next in terms of another year of climate negotiations coming up, and maybe giving an action that civil society organizations could prioritize. Who would like to go first?
I can go first. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think right now, being a young person, I turned 22 like a few months ago, and I was reflecting on like what it means. I mean, I turned 22 and I was just so upset and angry that it was during the same time that Gen Z protests happened in my country, and I was just so upset and angry at the state of the world. Is this the world that I'm going to live in the next 5 to 10 years? Is this what is going on? It's just at some point you just cannot believe that like all of this is happening and nobody's doing like nothing is being done about it. And the things that we do as young people is not enough. And this whole like imbalance of power of how much we care, but again, we don't have a lot of power to influence. Even though we have little wins, but our contributions remain limited. So I think every day we are faced with this disappointment, with all of these negative feelings, and every day we question whether we should just quit and let the world burn. Sometimes like I really genuinely wish to just let the world burn. It's like it's a hopeless cause. But despite all of these feelings, we still choose to show up. We still choose to like stay persistent. We still go to COP and see the same countries, see the same fossil fuel lobbyists try to eradicate our demands. But we still show up, and we will continue to show up, both at the national, at the regional, at the local level, at the international level. And I'm very glad that we're not only showing up in climate change, but we're also showing up in everywhere. And you see that like in light of the Gen Z protests that are happening. So yeah, I think my final thing is like we will continue to show up, we will continue this fight, and I hope like everyone could still support us and everyone could still keep this fight. I think it's very easy to be hopeless right now in these times of rising far right and Trump and everything. But I think there's still space for us to make a change. And I hope everyone could still keep this fight because we will.
Thank you, Manal. That's a great point to finish off with. Well, Amandine, would you like to go next, perhaps, with the final
Yeah, well, I
point?
just wanted to say that I'm not a policymaker, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know. But at least from a researcher point of view, we quickly ended up with my research team, but also I see research efforts elsewhere with the idea that we have to give visibility to civil society and to, in my case, to youth. And so it's the first time, of course, we've done scientific publications, research articles, we have a book that will come out, But we also, I for the first time made a number of efforts to just publicize also our results. I mentioned the open access database. We also have created what we call a story map. It's a website where, for instance, we have collected all youth statements within the international negotiations on biodiversity, climate, sustainable development goals. So you have the statements, you have the videos of the opening and closing sessions that Manal was mentioning. We also, because unfortunately the formats of scientific research do not enable us to exploit our 200 interviews on this website, we also have tried to put as many interview citations as possible, indicating the, again, I mean, anonymized, but indicating the age, origin, and environmental topic related to the quotation. And these quotations are about the motivations, but also the claims of the youth, so that what they would like to see. So, I mean, already giving visibility to all this, I think, is important because there is already a lot of engagement, but unfortunately, some groups within civil society are still a little bit set aside, and even of scientific research, we tend to focus on environmental NGOs or business, but youth, indigenous peoples, all sorts of other civil society groups, I think, are important, and giving them visibility is already a good thing. And I can mention other researchers, Laura Boulon-Cassis, Frida Burr, Jonathan Jefferson, that are trying to do this. And also just to mention that I have a number of colleagues also working on youth and security, youth and the peace agenda, youth and migration, because you mentioned refugees earlier, Manal. And they're all coming out with this idea that we have to give youth more visibility because they're doing a lot of things and we're not talking enough about that.
Thanks, Amandine. Franziska, would you have a final point to leave us with as well?
Yeah, no, I think this was also a nice summary of how we as academics can try to, of course, not impact, I mean, maybe also a little bit, but just like making problems apparent, right? Like collecting the data to show, look, youth is not one group, right? As also Manal said, but there's different concerns, there's different ways of how different constituencies work together. And I think that to me is part of the process, and that's how the UNFCCC and beyond is also a science-based endeavor, evidence-based endeavor. So I think for the next year, we should all keep doing research on this, and we should keep talking about this, because as Manal said, this is what is important, keeping the momentum pushing at national level, and of course beyond. And I think, for instance, just us organizing, but also youth actors, civil society actors organizing. So before the COPs, I'm also in the Ringo teams, right? So we all kind of coordinate too with our respective, let's say, strengths, right? Be it the young voices or the academic knowledge, trying to impact the process as much as possible. And I think this kind of organization and keeping the momentum up is what I see our crucial role, because it will be up to the states next year again to decide, but we can, I think, keep the momentum up and organize ourselves and share knowledge.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. And well, I see there's a question in the chat. I mean, I see you started answering it already, but it's regarding regional models for climate governance. And could these potentially be more effective? And what could that look like? So I don't know if you feel you've already answered this question, or if one of you three would like to come in on this. I feel like it's a very relevant topic, given how global governance is often turning into a coalition of the willing, with major actors excluding themselves, especially Trump's United States. So I think this is a very relevant question. Does someone want to come in on this?
Maybe just very briefly, I think we discussed this also in our reports, like what is the alternative, right? If we think that one forum with 196 maybe is not it, what else would it be? And I don't think we can or should get rid of this forum, because this is why maybe not always fast, right? This is where everyone comes together. And I think that in itself is the key strength. And then, for instance, when it comes to certain regional models, I think the EU is quite strong on setting standards, right? Regulations, directives, and so on. So I think regional models can go further. But I think it's still good to have this multilateral forum that brings people together. But then I think what is nice is also that within regions there's development also across regions, like interregional dialogues. And how are you actually dealing with adaptation challenges, right? So I think that's what Manal also then put into the chat here. So there's regional organization, but those then also meet at the COPs and maybe share experiences and best practices. So I think there is a lot of potential, but I don't think it can replace the multilateral.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that this already exists. I mean, a lot of coalitions already have their youth program. Like the African Union has their own Africa Youth Envoy Office, which again empowers young people to engage like at the regional level in terms of the AU. Also, the G20 have their own Y20. The Southeast Asian ASEAN also have their own youth program. So I think there's a lot that is already being done at the regional level. But I feel like it's just the world is so fragmented right now and so divided because I was following the negotiations last time, last COP, this COP, and you see that even the African position is very divided between African middle income countries and LDCs. And the LDC's position is kind of different. I mean, again, everyone is asking for the same things, like for more adaptation, for more climate finance. But again, LDCs have much, worse context and so on. And you see that the young people in LDCs and the young people from the broader African continent have totally different views. And at the regional level, there's a lot of fragmentation. So I also don't know, like, I don't know if multilateralism is the solution. And I also don't know if the regional blocks are the solution because it seems to me that there's just like a lot of, governance crises all over, not just in climate change. But I think I'd love to see how because again, multilateralism has always been the way since the Second World War, like through the United Nations. But I'm also, sorry, Franziska, I'm also very skeptical of whether multilateralism can really deliver or we just need block-based governance to solve these issues.
Well, thanks both for your responses, and thank you, Safia, for this question. That was really interesting. We are really running short of time here. I'd hate to keep you for too long, but I see, Mohammed, you've raised your hand, so maybe just if you have a quick question, feel free to go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much. I hope so I'm audible. So, my question is regarding to what this is an amazing session after the COP30 and about the pledges, when the pledges was done in Azerbaijan and also the pledges, of course, were done in Belém too. So, what were any of the panelists think that these multilateral organization can do? Deliver much as we youth, as I'm from Pakistan, and I do take benefit of the session that Pakistan is facing very much of climate change and all that. So what do you think that we should do hope on UN and all the multilateral organizations like UNFCCC, or that we should go with the flow as world is going more many multiple power centers as said. So
Thanks for the question. Well, panelists, feel free to step in if you'd like to answer.
I can come in on this one quickly. I think that right now personally, I feel like there's no country or bloc that is really pushing for more climate ambition because Pakistan and India, like they were one of the ones who are pushing like for no mention of fossil fuel because they depend on fossil fuel. So it feels to me that nobody is willing to like step in and have more leadership. And you can feel that after the US stepped out of the Paris Agreement, you can still feel that vacuum of leadership. Because the Paris Agreement, as much as we don't want to admit it, but the Paris Agreement was possible because the US pushed so hard for it. And there was a lot of momentum. But again, there was like some sort of someone taking in leadership. And now as the US steps out of that, the EU is not ambitious enough. Again, I'd love to know what you think, Franziska, but the EU is they did not want to sign the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and they said no, we already have that at home. We have the Fit by 55. But then why would you not sign the treaty as well? And China does not want to step in and fill in that vacuum left by the US. And it seems to me that, and again, like even the African Union, like the Africa group of negotiators in the final plenary, when Colombia was saying, no, we need like an outcome that mentions fossil fuel. the African group of negotiators was like, please, like, we are tired. We want to go home. We don't want to stay here forever. Can we just like end this? So it just feels to me that nobody's willing to take in like that leadership role and push for more ambition. And I think this is where we come in as young people. We should hold like our governments accountable so that when they go to these COPs, they actually speak for our demands and they speak for our realities because we are affected. I mean, Pakistan has floods. My country has like the worst drought crisis in like since forever. So I think when this is where we come in, and this is why we need to push for. We need to keep acting and we need to keep the momentum going.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe just a brief reflection. I do think the question of also who has power in the negotiations is different depending on your definition. It's a very political science answer, I apologize. But research also shows that, for instance, small island development states, in terms of really having the heavy vulnerability, right? That in itself can also give a powerful role. And I think, yeah, the fossil fuel debate is a very difficult one. I was not at the COP now, but from what I read was that the EU actually threatened to leave at one point as well when it was in COP 30. Like, no, this is too weak. We cannot agree on that. So that's again where maybe as a hopeful speaker, I would say, well, we do see that, and we also saw with what Manal mentioned with the Colombia intervention, like we cannot agree on this if this is not met. I think multilateralism will always, to some extent, remain slow because you want to keep everyone on the boat, let's say it like that. But then you should just have your little speedboat next to it and go ahead and try to create the metaphor doesn't fully work, but you create the water so that the other boat goes quicker. And I think that's where I'm remaining optimistic, but also hoping that indeed civil society actors, as Banal said, keep pushing because that will help build this momentum as well. But yeah, I'm hopeful for next year. Next COP of implementation, we shall see.
The COP of implementation was supposed to be this one. Anyways.
I know. So the next one will be another one. Yeah.
Yeah, and then next year we'll also say, oh, the next one.
Well, we will just meet again next year to see whether our expectations will have been met.
Thank you, everyone. Well, this has been a really great conversation. So thanks everyone for participating in the webinar. And especially big thank you to today's panelists, Franziska, Amandine, and Manal. You've all brought something really important to the table. And yeah, you've provided some fascinating points that I'd love to reconnect on soon. And thanks also to everyone who asked questions. And well, this will be recorded, will be available in future as well if you'd like to come back to any points we mentioned. And there will be future webinars as part of this Ensured webinar series. So feel free to drop in on any of the other ones as well, which will be on other global governance areas. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Take care.